In the dusty heart of New Junction, a place so parched the wind itself seemed to creak with thirst, the train screeched to a halt like a dying animal. Dust swirled like spirits unsettled, chasing after the iron beast that exhaled coal and fire. But before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. The platform, a slab of sun-bleached wood, groaned under the weight of waiting eyes. They weren't there to greet someone. Not exactly. They were there to assess her. Marigold Baines stepped down from the train, one hand clutching a battered carpetbag, the other steadying the brim of her bonnet against the vicious wind. She squinted against the sunlight, her gray-blue eyes scanning the crowd. There were no smiles, only squinting faces, murmurs, and a few sneers poorly hidden beneath dusty mustaches. She had known they wouldn't be pleased. A mail-order bride was rarely what the townsfolk imagined, and even less so when the bride in question was considered plain. Her dress was practical, a faded lavender with simple stitching and a hem slightly frayed from the long ride. Her hair was pinned in a no-nonsense bun, and there wasn't a speck of rouge on her cheeks. No ribbons, no perfume, no illusions. A cough broke the silence. Then, a boy no more than 10 called out, "She ain't pretty, Pay." The man next to him grunted and spat into the dirt. "Looks like she'd do more scrubbing than smiling." Marigold's spine stiffened, but she said nothing. She had crossed 3 states, given up her post at a schoolhouse, and carried her entire life in one worn bag. She hadn't come to New Junction to impress them. She'd come because she had nowhere else to go, and because the letter had promised kindness. A home, a husband. But it wasn't the sender of the letter who met her. Not exactly. Miss Baines? The voice was smooth, calm, with the kind of depth that suggested still water and buried stones. She turned to face him, and there he stood, Thomas Calder, the blacksmith's son. Not the one who'd written to her, but his younger brother. He was tall, broad-shouldered, arms dusted with soot from the forge. His shirt was rolled to the elbows, revealing strong, work-hardened forearms. A leather apron hung loosely over his frame, as if he'd come straight from the anvil, but it was his eyes that startled her. Green, like prairie grass before the drought. Not with pity, not with amusement, but curiosity. "My brother fell ill," he sawed, glancing to the side as if ashamed. "He sent for a bride before he took sick, but, well, he won't be getting out of bed any time soon. Pa sent me to fetch you." Her heart sank. She had expected awkwardness, disappointment, but illness? And what happens now? She asked, steadying her voice. He didn't flinch. Didn't stammer. "That depends. You can stay in the house as planned. We don't turn folks out. Or you can take the next train back. There wouldn't be another train for weeks." "I'll stay," she said. "And she didn't say because I have no other choice." She didn't have to. He nodded once. "Let me take that." He reached for her bag. She hesitated, then handed it over. Their fingers brushed. Hers were calloused from chalk and paper. His were rough from hammers and heat. They didn't speak again until they reached the Calder homestead. A weather-beaten house, large but worn. Like a strong man past his prime. Inside, it smelled of iron and old bread. His mother appeared in the doorway, her dress stained with flour and her hair tied back with a faded ribbon. "So, you're the one," she said. It wasn't cruel, just tired. And then, unexpectedly, she added, "Well, he needs a good woman by his side. We'll make do." They showed her to a small room near the kitchen, not the master bedroom. Not yet. As night fell, Marigold sat on the edge of the narrow bed, listening to the creak of the house, the distant clang of metal from the forge, the hoot of an owl. She thought of the schoolhouse, the students she'd left behind, the city that had deemed her too old, too dull, too rigid. She thought of the letter, the soft promises etched in ink. And then she thought of Thomas. Not the brother who'd written to her, but the one who'd carried her bag without flinching, who hadn't looked at her with disdain. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight she was not alone, and that was a start. The morning in New Junction broke with the sound of hammers striking iron. It echoed through the still air like a call to prayer, pulling Marigold from a restless sleep. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then the coarse sheets beneath her fingertips, the faint scent of coal, and the chirping of birds outside a single cracked window reminded her she was here. She had arrived. She splashed her face with cool water from the porcelain basin, buttoned her dress, and tied her boots tightly. The mirror above the washstand gave her little comfort. She looked no different from the woman who had stepped off the train the day before, yet everything had changed. She found Mrs. Calder in the kitchen, already elbow-deep in flour. "Bread won't wait for morning," the older woman muttered without looking up. "Hope you're not the kind that lies abed till noon." "I was a schoolteacher," Marigold replied evenly. "I'm used to rising early," a grunt. "Then you'll do." Breakfast was simple: cornbread, eggs, and coffee thick enough to tar a roof. Thomas entered from outside, arms streaked with soot, a towel slung over one shoulder. His shirt clung to his frame, sweat shining along the curve of his throat. He looked at her, gave a curt nod, and sat down without a word. "Thank you," Marigold said, placing a plate before him. He paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "For what?" "For not pretending yesterday. For telling the truth about your brother." A slow shrug. "No use pretending. People out here respect work and honesty more than appearances." "And yet—" They all stared. She said quietly. His fork clicked against the plate. "They're small-town folks. They don't like what they don't understand," Mrs. Calder snorted. "They don't like what they think they understand either. A woman shows up unmarried, plain, no family. They assume the worst. Don't give them the satisfaction of being right." After breakfast, Marigold insisted on helping with chores. Mrs. Calder watched her knead dough. CHOP would sweep the porch. "Work like someone who's done without," she remarked. Marigold nodded. "I have." They didn't speak more of it. That afternoon, she visited the sickroom. The man she'd come to marry, Ernest Calder, lay pale and gaunt beneath a heavy quilt. He opened his eyes briefly, coughed, and turned away. Marigold sat anyway, reading aloud from a book of sermons and marking the times when he shifted or grunted. She knew better than to expect gratitude. "He's been sick a long time," Thomas said later, finding her beneath the sycamore tree that shaded the well. She startled. "I didn't hear you." "You read to him. That was kind." "It felt like the only thing I could do." Thomas squinted into the distance. "You didn't have to stay, you know. No one would have blamed you. I would have blamed myself." Silence fell between them, not tense, but thoughtful. "My father," he said finally, "died before Ernest sent that letter. But we kept the shop running. I stayed because, well, someone had to. Now you're here, and it seems we're all stuck with choices someone else made." She looked at him then, really looked. The soot-stained shirt, the slight slump in his shoulders, the tired way his green eyes carried years he hadn't yet lived. "I don't think we're stuck," she said quietly. "I think we're just beginning." The town of New Junction wasn't much to look at. A single street of storefronts, a general store, a saloon with faded paint and squeaky floorboards, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse. Marigold walked the dusty road that first week. Clutching a shopping list and a small purse of coins. She ignored the stares, the whispers. That's her. The bride they ordered in like freight. Heard she came from a school in Missouri. They must have been desperate. But not everyone looked at her with contempt. Miss Edith, the preacher's daughter, offered a shy smile. "You're the new Calder girl." "I suppose I am." "You don't look like a bride," Marigold smiled faintly. "Neither did I expect to become one," Edith grinned. "Well, you'll need ribbon. You can't go to Sunday service looking like a broom." Marigold laughed, and it startled her. She hadn't laughed in weeks. She returned home to find Thomas working in the forge. The heat made the air shimmer, and the sound of metal striking metal felt almost holy. He noticed her watching. "You ever work with iron?" "Only metaphorically. I was a teacher." "Then this will be new." She stepped closer. The forge breathed like a beast. The anvil was stained with old battles, the hammer an extension of his hand. "Why did you take up blacksmithing?" she asked. "Because it was loud," he said. "When the world gets too quiet, the noise helps." She understood more than he realized. Some silences were unbearable. That Sunday, Marigold wore a pale blue dress borrowed from Mrs. Calder. It was a bit tight in the shoulders, a bit too young in its cut, but it was clean. Thomas offered his arm. "We should walk together," he said. "Let them see." "See what?" "That you belong here." The church buzzed as they entered. Eyes followed them to their pew. The sermon was on redemption, on the parable of the barren fig tree. Marigold listened intently. "A tree may not bear fruit for years," the preacher intoned. "But with care, with patience, it may yet thrive." Her eyes found Thomas across the room. He was watching her. When the final hymn ended, a few folks nodded at her. Some even smiled. Progress. Weeks passed. Marigold settled into life with quiet grace. She baked. She tended the garden. She sat with Ernest, who never spoke, though his eyes sometimes followed her. One afternoon, she found herself alone in the barn, reorganizing old saddles. Thomas entered, brushing hay from his shirt. "You don't have to do that." "I like order," she said simply. He leaned against the doorframe. "I remember something from when I was little. Ernest used to build little wooden animals for me. Carved them from scraps. I kept one. A horse. Had no tail, but I loved it anyway. Where is it now?" "Gone. Probably tossed during one of Ma's cleanings." Marigold pulled something from her apron. "I carved this. From a fence post you left near the—" "Well, a tiny horse. Crude, yes, but unmistakably a horse. With a tail." His throat bobbed. "Why?" "Because you don't smile enough. And I thought maybe it would help." He took it gently, as if it were fragile. "Thank you." One evening, a storm rolled through. The sky turned green. Wind howled. Lightning split the heavens. Ernest's condition worsened. Mrs. Calder paced. Thomas stood outside his brother's room like a sentinel. Marigold sat beside the bed, holding Ernest's hand. "I won't lie to you," she whispered. "You're not the man I dreamed of. But you brought me here. And for that, I won't leave you." His fingers twitched. Eyes fluttered. A rasp of breath. And then double quotes Marigold double quote her name. Soft as a breeze. She gasped. "Ernest?" His eyes opened, bleary, uncertain. But awake. Thomas appeared in the doorway, eyes wide. Ernest coughed. "Water." Thomas rushed forward. Marigold helped him lift the cup to his brother's lips. It was the first sip of life he'd taken in weeks. The next morning, Ernest sat up, propped with pillows. His voice was thin, but present. "So," he rasped, "you're the woman who answered my letter." Marigold sat on a stool by his bed. "I am. And you stayed." "I did." He looked toward the window. "They said I might die, but I guess I wasn't ready." "Maybe," she said gently. "You were waiting." Outside, Thomas watched her through the window. Watched the way she smoothed the blanket, fluffed the pillow, listened intently. His mother approached. "You're staring," she said. "She doesn't belong here, doesn't she? She's done more for us in a month than half the town's done in years." "That's not what I meant." Mrs. Calder looked at him. "Really looked. You want her to stay, not for Ernest, for you." Thomas didn't answer. He didn't have to, that night. As Marigold stepped out for air, she found Thomas waiting by the fence. "He's better," she said. "He is." They stood in silence. The stars blinked overhead, vast and distant. What happens now? She asked. Thomas exhaled. I don't know. He asked for a wife. But I find myself wishing he hadn't. Because you pity me? He turned to her sharply. No, because I see you. And it's killing me that I didn't write that letter first. Her breath caught. You deserve a man who chose you, he said, his voice breaking. Not one who wrote a letter from loneliness and forgot what he asked for. She touched his hand. And wiry I stayed. Their eyes met, and something shifted. Neither spoke, but something began. Something neither one of them could yet name. Would you like me to continue with part 3? The days in New Junction rolled by with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a wagon over dry earth. Life at the Calder homestead took on its own tempo, stitched together by chores, glances, and unspoken questions. Marigold, though still technically a guest, found herself woven into the routine like thread through muslin. She rose before dawn. The roosters hadn't even cleared their throats when she was already pumping water, folding linens, or tending to. The hens, she didn't ask permission. She didn't wait to be told. The Calder household didn't operate on sentiment, but it did recognize usefulness. Mrs. Calder watched her with something between cautious approval and quiet awe. Thomas. Well, Thomas said little, but he always noticed. When Marigold refilled the lamp oil, stacked kindling near the forge, or left bread cooling in clean cloth on the sill, his gaze followed. Silent, but steady. Ernest had good days and bad. On the good days, he would sit up with the help of pillows, grumbling about soup being too thin or the sun being too bright. On the bad, he would barely speak at all, sinking into himself, like a rock into still water. It was during one such quiet afternoon that the line between obligation and something else began to blur. Marigold was in the garden, knees deep in loam, coaxing stubborn beets from the parched soil. The summer had come in harder than expected, and the ground was cracked, reluctant to give up anything easily. You're planting too close to the fence, came Thomas's voice. She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. I measured the distance. They'll have room. He squatted beside her, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Ain't the room, it's the shadows. Fence will steal their light come late summer. Beats like sun. She blinked. You read about gardening? He shrugged. I listen when Ma talks. She smiled faintly. That explains it. You're better than you let on. He didn't smile back. But his voice was gentler when he said, you don't have to do all this. No one expects you to break your back just to prove something. I'm not proving anything, she replied. I'm surviving. The words hung there between them. A quiet truth, more powerful than any declaration. He reached for a stubborn weed. Pulled. If free, tossed it to the pile. You're not the only one. That evening, Thomas returned late from the forge. His shirt was soaked through, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. Marigold had waited, though she pretended not to. She poured a basin of water, handed him a clean cloth. You're burning yourself out. Orders came in from 3 Pines. Wagon wheels, 2 plowshares, and a church bell hook. I couldn't say no. You could. He dipped the cloth in the basin and rubbed the back of his neck. Maybe, but folks depend on us. Marigold sat nearby, her needlework forgotten in her lap. Who do you depend on, Thomas? He looked at her really. Looked, and for a moment he didn't have an answer. Word spread that Ernest was improving. The doctor from nearby Cider Ridge came to check his pulse, listen to his lungs, and marvel at the turnaround. Must be her cooking, he joked, or maybe it's love that pulled him back. Marigold flinched. Thomas didn't laugh. Ernest, propped up on a mound of pillows, said nothing, just watched her. Always watching. Later that night, he finally spoke more than a sentence. Do you want this? She looked up from her sewing. Want what? Me, this, the life you signed up for. She paused. I want a place to be needed. A reason to wake up early and fall into bed tired. He chuckled, though it sounded more like a wheeze. Not exactly love poetry. I didn't come here for poetry. Did you come here for me? The question was not cruel, not barbed. But real. Marigold stood, walked to the window. Outside, the moon cast silver across the yard, where Thomas was fixing the porch railing by lantern light. I came for a promise, one that was made in good faith. And I've kept mine. And if I recover, if I can work again? She turned slowly. Then we talk, like grown people. Not sickbeds and strangers, he nodded. It was enough. Days bled into one. Another. The forge roared. The hens clucked. The wind tossed dust through the fields like it was sowing ghosts. And through it all, Marigold and Thomas danced a slow, silent waltz of almost an maybe. Until the night of the fire. It started in the barn. A spark from a lantern. A careless pitchfork left against a beam. No one knew for sure. But by the time the family smelled smoke, the sky was painted orange. Thomas burst through the door, shirt half buttoned, eyes wild. Get May and Ernest out. I'll take the well. Marigold didn't hesitate. She grabbed Mrs. Calder, roused Ernest, threw a shawl over their heads, and led them out into the night. The fire roared like a beast set loose. Flames curled and snapped. Wood groaned. Chickens screamed. The sky pulsed with heat. Marigold turned to run back. Thomas was still inside. Mrs. Calder grabbed her arm. You can't. He's in there. And then he emerged. Smoke blackened, shirt torn, dragging a bucket with one arm and a sack of tools with the other. She ran to him, threw her arms around him before she could think. Fool, she whispered into his chest. Stubborn, beautiful fool. He held her there. In the distance, the barn collapsed in on itself, a cathedral of flames dying in a heap of embers. But they stood still. In the dirt, in the ash, in the truth, they rebuilt slowly. Neighbors brought spare lumber. Edith came with soup. Even the preacher rolled up his sleeves. One morning, as they hammered a new beam into place, Thomas looked at Marigold and asked simply, "Why did you really stay?" She didn't answer right away. She set her hammer down, took a breath. Because I felt something here, not right away. Not from Ernest's letter, but from you. From the way you look when you don't know anyone's watching. From the way you don't say much, but you see everything. Because you made space for me without asking me to prove I belonged. He looked away. But she saw his jaw clench. I ain't perfect. Neither am I. I didn't write the letter, but you lived the promise. His eyes met hers, green and storm-swept. Then maybe ... he began. Maybe, she agreed. That evening, Ernest called her to his room. He looked tired, paler than usual. You love him. It wasn't a question. She nodded. Then go to him. Ernest, I came here for you. No, he said gently. You came for a new life. And that life doesn't belong to me. Not anymore. Tears pricked her eyes. You deserved better. So did you. He offered her his hand. Friends? She took it, always. Outside, she found Thomas under the stars again, just like that first night. He looked up when she approached. He let me go, she said. Thomas swallowed. So what now? She stepped closer. Close enough to hear his breath hitch. Now, she whispered, we stop pretending we aren't already something more. He kissed her. The kiss was not desperate, or wild, or sweeping. It was steady, strong, real, and it felt like coming home. Summer bled into early fall, and the once scorched fields of New Junction slowly softened beneath cooler skies. The rhythm of life at the Calder homestead settled again, this time more evenly. There was no longer the awkward shuffle of strangers under one roof, nor the brittle expectation that every day might be someone's last. What remained was a curious sort of harmony, not yet love in full bloom, but something sure-footed, like the roots of a tree finding purchase after a hard drought. Marigold woke each morning with a purpose that no longer needed to be spoken aloud. The house had become hers in quiet, undeniable ways, in how the windows were always cracked to let in the breeze, in the bread that always rose high and warm on the hearth, in the subtle order she brought to every cupboard and chore. Thomas rose. Earlier now, and when he left for the forge, he lingered a little longer near the kitchen door, just long enough to see her standing at the stove or washing herbs in the basin. Once he brought her a copper hairpin shaped like a rose. "It's not much," he said, setting it carefully beside her morning tea. Marigold picked it up with trembling fingers. "It's beautiful," she replied. "You made this?" He shrugged. "Scrap from a wagon repair. Thought you might like something that wasn't. Born of necessity." She smiled and turned slightly so he could place it in her hair. Their hands touched, briefly but deeply. Sunday service became a ritual they shared. The walk to town took 20 minutes, but they took it slow, arms often brushing. The town watched them with a mixture of curiosity and quiet concession. Whispers still followed Marigold sometimes, but the edges had dulled. She wasn't the mail-order bride anymore. She was the woman who stayed through fire and sickness, who helped rebuild what others had written off. The preacher took notice. One Sunday, as the congregation rose for the final hymn, he cleared his throat. "Before we go, I'd like to ask the Calder family to stay a moment. I've a question that's been weighing on my heart." The murmurs began the moment folks exited. Marigold felt a flush rise in her cheeks. Thomas shifted beside her but said nothing. The preacher came to them, hat in hand. "I know how things started," he said gently, "but I also know what I've seen since. God works in mysterious ways. Sometimes we find our path not in the journey we planned, but in the road we're willing to walk." He looked between them. "If you two are to be together in truth, I would gladly perform the ceremony, whenever you're ready." Thomas opened his mouth, but Marigold spoke first. "We thank you." "We do, but this isn't something we can rush." The preacher nodded, smiling. "Then I'll keep the book handy." Outside, Thomas looked at her, brows raised. "You really think it's too soon?" She linked her arm with his. "No, I just think when it happens, it should be because we chose it, not because the town is waiting." He grinned. "Fair enough." At the Calder homestead, Ernest had taken to walking. With a cane. The doctor's prediction of permanent weakness proved true, but his mind and voice returned with surprising clarity. He no longer needed a caretaker, though he never asked Marigold to stop visiting. One crisp afternoon, she found him sitting beneath the sycamore, reading an old poetry book. "Didn't expect to find you quoting Keats," she said, setting down a basket of apples near his feet. Ernest chuckled. "There's more to me than hammer and bellows." She sat on the bench beside him. The silence was easy now, familiar. "Do you ever wish," he said after a while, "that things had gone to plan?" Marigold thought about it, sometimes. "But then I remember how little good my plans ever did me. I had a whole life mapped out back east, teaching until I was gray, living alone in a room full of books. It would have been comfortable, predictable, but it wouldn't have been this." "Thomas is a good man," Ernest said. "Quiet, but steady. He never much liked change." "But you've changed him," she smiled. "He's changed me too." Ernest looked out toward the fields. "I'm glad it was you." "If not me, then him." She touched his hand briefly. "You gave me a place to land. That means something." He nodded, eyes glinting with something that looked like peace. That night, a harvest moon rose. The town gathered in the square for music and cider, bonfires and dancing. Marigold hadn't intended to go, but Edith arrived with a borrowed shawl and a determined grin. "You're coming. No arguments." Thomas raised a brow when she appeared, hair loose over her shoulders, the copper pin gleaming beneath the lantern. "Light, you clean up real nice," he teased. "I do my best." They danced, not well, but together. His hands at her waist, hers at his shoulders. Around them, music swelled, laughter echoed. The town that had once greeted her with side eyes and murmurs now clapped along. Later, beneath the stars, Thomas pulled her aside. "You said you wanted to wait, but I've waited long enough." Marigold's breath caught. "What are you saying?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a ring, simple, sturdy, with a tiny garnet set into its curve. "It's not fancy. Not like what some girls dream of, but it's real, and I made it myself. Just like this life we've been building." She looked at it, then at him. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I didn't even ask." "You didn't need to." He slipped the ring onto her finger. And then, surrounded by firelight and fiddle strings, he kissed her again. The wedding was small. Just family, Edith, and the preacher. Ernest stood beside Thomas as best man. Leaning heavily on his cane, Mrs. Calder wept quietly into her handkerchief. Marigold wore a dress of cream linen. No veil, no fuss. Just the copper pin in her hair and a heart full of certainty. They said their vows beneath the sycamore tree, where new leaves had just begun to bud. Where promises once whispered alone were now spoken aloud. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Thomas squeezed her hand. And for the first time in her life, Marigold Baines, now Marigold Calder, felt entirely, deeply, and irrevocably chosen. The days following the wedding were golden. Golden, not in any extravagant or fanciful sense, but in the way that flour dust clings to fingers and light spills across the kitchen floor at just the right time. In the way the forge hummed steadily, and a name written in ink became a life signed with trust. Marigold Calder moved through the Calder homestead not as a visitor or a caretaker, but as a woman rooted. Their union had not begun with sparks or sweeping declarations, but in its stead had come something finer, the slow burn of steady hands building a life together. Every morning, Thomas left for the forge after breakfast, often pressing a kiss to her temple or brushing his hand against hers. Marigold still rose first, now sharing her tasks not with tension, but with the easy familiarity of shared space. She learned the rhythms of his day, the things he mumbled when tools went missing, and the smile he gave only when he knew she was watching. She smiled more now, but peace, like a fragile fence. Always faced the threat of weather. The first hint came in a letter. It arrived one afternoon, brought by the Cider Ridge postboy, who came on horseback every second Tuesday. Marigold was baking, arms dusted in flour, when she heard the hooves outside. Thomas met the rider while wiping his hands on a cloth, and when he returned, his brow was creased. He didn't say much, just slid the envelope onto the table beside her and stepped outside again, muttering something about the forge. Marigold turned the letter over. The seal bore the stamp of a legal firm. She opened it with a paring knife, careful not to tear the paper. It read, "To Mr. Thomas Calder, we regret to inform you that a lien has been placed on the land formerly belonging to Jeremiah Calder, now held in your name. It appears your father borrowed heavily against the homestead prior to his passing. Due to missed payments, the property is now subject to collection." Her hands shook. "You may appeal the action by settling the outstanding debt in full within 60 days. Failure to do so will result in foreclosure and auctioning of the land." She read the letter again and again. When she finally walked to the forge, the smell of smoke and sweat wrapped around her like a second skin. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Thomas didn't look up. Didn't know myself until today." She held the paper. "Your father borrowed against the land?" He stopped hammering. The sound ceased. He was sick, trying to keep things running when Ernest got hurt. It was always barely enough. Marigold stood there a long moment, the paper crackling in her fingers. "How much?" He glanced at her then. Eyes tired. "More than we have," she wanted to yell. "To cry," but instead, she stepped closer and rested her hand on his arm. "We'll figure it out." He laughed, bitter and low. "You married into a sinking ship, Marigold." She tilted his chin with her fingers. Then we bail water until we float again." That evening, they gathered around the table. Ernest leaned on his cane and listened in silence as Thomas laid it out. Mrs. Calder, for once, had no criticism. Only a quiet determination behind her eyes. "We have 60 days, Thomas said. "After that, the land's not ours." Ernest nodded slowly. "We sell the silver." "The old family spoons." "Not nearly enough," Mrs. Calder murmured. "What about the cattle?" Marigold asked. 3 cows and a mule barely worth the cart he pulls." They sat in silence until Edith arrived. "There's a solution," she said, sitting primly at the table, her usual smile tempered by urgency. "The railroad. They're laying track north of us. Word is they need blacksmiths." Thomas frowned. "That would mean leaving the forge. Or," she continued, "setting up a new one closer to the work. They pay well. Room and board included for workers and their families." Marigold and Thomas exchanged a glance. "It would mean moving," Marigold said softly. "And leaving Ernest," Thomas added. Ernest spoke up. "I'm not an invalid anymore. If it means keeping this family above water, do it. But the idea of leaving—" It tasted like copper on Marigold's tongue. This home, rebuilt with ash and affection, had become hers. How could she leave it behind? They spent the next few days exploring options. Thomas rode to Cider Ridge to meet with the legal firm. They were polite but firm. "Unless you can pay in full, Mr. Calder, there's little we can do. Can we negotiate a payment plan?" "That would have to be approved, and would still require collateral." Back home, Marigold pulled out her old ledger, the one she kept tucked behind the flour sacks. Inside were small savings, her earnings from the schoolhouse days, tips she'd earned when she played the piano at a boarding home during her first winter in Missouri. It wasn't much, but it was something. She showed it to Thomas. "We could get halfway there," she said, "if we stretch." He looked at her with such tenderness, she nearly looked away. "You'd give up your last savings for this?" "It's not giving it up," she replied. "It's planting it in something worth saving." They agreed on a plan. They would sell what they could. Marigold would take in mending work from the town. Thomas would split his days between the forge and traveling repairs. Ernest offered to carve wooden toys again, something he hadn't done since childhood. "People still buy those?" "Folks like things made with hands," Ernest said. "Toys remind them of better times." They became a factory of hope. One nail, one henline, one wagon repair at a time. The town watched, curious. Slowly sympathy turned to admiration. Even the grocer, who once sneered at Marigold for buying bruised apples, offered a discount. "You Calder folks are stubborn," he said. "We are," Marigold replied, smiling. "Comes from loving land that doesn't give up easy." Weeks passed. They kept working. The air grew colder. Leaves curled. The forge burned later into the night. Thomas's hands blistered. Marigold's fingers ached from sewing. But they pressed. And then, one afternoon, a stranger arrived. He stepped off the Cider Ridge wagon in a black coat, boots polished, hat low. He carried a briefcase. "I'm here about the Calder property," he said, handing Thomas a sealed envelope. They gathered around the kitchen table again. Marigold unfolded the paper, hands shaking. It read, "Due to partial payment received and significant community advocacy, the lien has been suspended. The remainder of the debt has been purchased privately and forgiven. Your land is yours." Effective immediately. Stunned silence. Then, "Who?" Thomas asked. The man tipped his hat. "You have friends, it seems." Miss Edith Turner led the charge. Crowdfunded. With the church, the town matched every dollar. Marigold covered her mouth. Thomas looked out the window, jaw clenched. "We don't deserve this," he said. "You earned it," the man said simply. With every swing of that hammer, every thread sewn, every word held in grace. He left. The house sat quiet. Then Ernest laughed. A deep, rich, clean laugh. We keep the land, we keep the forge. Thomas turned to Marigold. We keep each other. That night, they celebrated with stew and cider. Mrs. Calder even brought out the old fiddle. Marigold danced barefoot in the kitchen, her skirt swirling. And Thomas, still in his work shirt, lifted her into his arms. We were almost buried, he whispered, and now we rise. She kissed his cheek. We rise because we have roots. Outside, snow began to fall. Inside, a fire crackled. And in the heart of New Junction, the Calder house glowed with something stronger than luck. It glowed with home. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now back to the story. Would you like me to continue with part 6? The first frost of the season settled on the Calder homestead, like a whispered reminder that time marches forward whether one is ready or not. The wedding was behind them, but life did not pause to admire the vows or the tender exchanges beneath. The sycamore tree, chickens still needed feeding, tools dulled from use, and in the far stretch of the horizon, change was stirring again. Marigold awoke early, as always, her hand resting on the warm space beside her. Thomas was already gone, likely tending the forge or splitting firewood. Married life had not softened their routines. If anything, it had sharpened them. Their partnership had been forged under pressure, and now it held firm. She tied her hair with the copper pin he'd given her, tucked her feet into boots, and stepped outside. The fields were quiet. A soft layer of white clung to every blade of grass, every fence post. The barn, rebuilt and reinforced since the fire, loomed like a promise kept. She found Thomas by the water trough, jaw clenched against the morning cold. He glanced up when she approached, his expression shifting. "Cold enough to crack bone," he said. "Then come in and warm them." "I made coffee." He nodded, wiping his hands on his coat before following her inside. They sat by the stove, mugs in hand, steam curling between them like smoke signals. "We should get ahead on firewood," she said. "Already cut 2 stacks yesterday. Might need 3 more if this winter's anything like the last." She leaned back. "We could get the twins to help." He raised a brow. "The Dawson twins? The ones who nearly set their outhouse on fire last spring?" She grinned. "That was one time," he grunted. "They chopped more air than wood." But he was smiling, and that was enough. The town of New Junction, once distant and wary, had begun to fold Marigold into its rhythm. The general storekeeper greeted her by name now. Children she didn't know waved from porches. And once a week, she gathered with the women at the church to quilt, mend, and talk about everything and nothing. It was Edith who gave her the idea. "You taught back east, right?" "I did." "Well, we haven't had a proper school teacher since Mrs. Grafton ran off with the farrier." Marigold blinked. "The farrier?" Edith smirked. "It was quite the scandal. I'm not certified anymore." "Doesn't matter. You've got more sense than anyone in this town. And the children need someone." Marigold considered it. She hadn't stood at a blackboard in years, hadn't recited poetry or corrected spelling with red ink. But the idea settled in her chest like a coal catching flame. When she told Thomas that evening, he didn't say anything right away, just kept oiling a horseshoe. "It wouldn't take away from the homestead," she said. "Classes would be in the church. 3 days a week to start." He nodded slowly. "You miss it." "I do." "Then do it." She touched his arm. "You sure? You kept us all alive last spring, Marigold. You want to teach again, you don't need permission. Just go." The schoolroom was little more than a back hall of the church with rickety desks and warped floorboards. But Marigold entered that space like a queen reclaiming a throne. She dusted windows, lined shelves, borrowed books, and stitched curtains from leftover linens. By the end of the week, it looked like learning had always lived there. On the first Day of class, 6 children arrived. By the second, 12. By the third, parents were coming by to offer ink bottles and stale biscuits, and promises to help however they could. Thomas dropped in once, leaning against the doorway, watching her read aloud to a circle of rapt faces. When she glanced up, he winked. Her heart stuttered. This, she realized, was how you built a life, one nail, one lesson, one knowing smile at a time. But winter is not kind in New Junction. A storm hit 2 weeks before Christmas. Snow blanketed the roads, ice sealed wells, and the wind howled like a grief too old to name. The forge could barely stay warm. The livestock needed extra care. And Mrs. Calder came down with a cough that would not leave. Marigold tended her day and night, spooning broth between cracked lips, keeping the fire stoked. Thomas stayed near too, his face drawn, his voice hoarse from worry. One night, when the wind knocked loose a shutter, Marigold sat beside her mother-in-law's bed and prayed. "She's tough," Thomas whispered from the doorway. "So was Sarah." He froze. She stood. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said." He crossed to her, took her hands. "No, I'm glad you did. She was my sister. She died in the storm like this. Fever took her in 2 days." Marigold pulled him into an embrace. "She'd be proud of you. She'd like you," he murmured. They stood like that for a long time. The only warmth came from the fire and the bond they had forged in its light. Mrs. Calder survived. But she lost much of her strength. Come spring, she would no longer be able to manage the house alone. Marigold insisted she move into the downstairs room. Thomas reinforced the windows. Ernest carried blankets without being asked. They became, somehow, not just a family born of marriage, but a household woven by survival. And through it all, Marigold taught. She taught reading and arithmetic, yes, but also music, letters, even history, and stories. Always stories. And one day, a girl with a braid too tight and shoes 2 sizes too small asked, "Miss Calder, did you always want to teach?" Marigold knelt down. "No," she said. "I wanted to be seen, and teaching helped me see others." The girl nodded like she understood, and maybe she did. The spring thaw came late, but it came. Thomas planted early. Ernest helped design new tools. Mrs. Calder took to writing letters to distant cousins. And Marigold found herself at the piano. Again, playing in the evenings while supper warmed and twilight colored the walls. One night, as she played a soft melody, Thomas knelt beside her. "You know what this is?" he said, placing a hand on her knee. "What?" "Peace." She looked down at him. "And how long do you think it will last?" He shrugged. "Long enough." "Long enough for what?" "To know we earned it." She turned back to the piano, hands resting on the keys. "Then play it with me," she said. And together, they played a tune only they could hear. "Would you like me to continue with part 7? By the time summer stretched its golden limbs across New Junction again, Marigold could feel the difference in her bones. Not just the heat or the long days, but something subtler, something rooted. Her heart had grown fuller, her days busier. And yet the stillness she once sought had finally arrived. Her classroom now held 20 students, each with mismatched chairs and varying penmanship. They called her Miss Marigold, or sometimes Mrs. Calder, when they were being particularly formal. She answered to both. The Calder homestead had become more than land and walls. It was a patchwork of memories and chores, and laughter at dusk. Mrs. Calder, though frailer now, had found joy in mentoring the girls who passed through the church sewing group. Ernest had fashioned a clever new plow attachment that had farmers across 2 counties dropping by to learn. And Thomas, well, Thomas was the anchor to all of it. He worked longer hours now that business was steady, sometimes even taking orders from nearby towns. But he never missed supper, never left without kissing Marigold goodbye, never let her go to sleep with a furrowed brow or cold feet. One afternoon, As thunderclouds loomed in the distance and the scent of cut hay hung thick in the air, a letter arrived. Marigold recognized the hand before she opened it. It had been over a year since she'd seen that looping script. She sat on the porch swing, unfolded the paper, and began to read. Marigold, I know it's been long, and perhaps I don't deserve to write it all. But I heard of your marriage through a cousin, and I wanted to say something I never got the chance to say before you left. I'm sorry. I should have listened. Should have believed in your dreams instead of trying to pull you into mine. I thought I was saving you from a hard life, but maybe I just didn't understand how strong you were. I hope you're happy, truly. Erin Arena, her first proposal. Her first real heartbreak. She folded the letter once, then again. She had nothing bitter to say. Only a quiet gratitude that she had not settled for someone who couldn't see the woman she would become. That night, she showed the letter to Thomas. He read it, then set it aside and took her hand. Do you miss him? I miss who I thought he was. But I don't miss what we had. You ever wish you went a different way? She looked at him. Never. He kissed her fingers one by one. Then I'll keep earning that answer. The county fair came. In mid-July. It was a grand affair this time, bigger than usual thanks to a bumper harvest and a traveling band that brought violins and strange new instruments from the city. Marigold baked pies for the contest. Thomas entered a wrought iron gate he'd spent 6 weeks perfecting. Edith submitted hand-stitched quilts. The entire town buzzed with preparation. Children practiced sack races. Farmers compared corn. And when the day came, banners flapped in. The breeze and the air smelled of sugar and dust. Marigold didn't expect to win, but she did. First place, apple cinnamon with a honey glaze, the ribbon read. Thomas whistled. Guess I married more than a pretty face. She jabbed him in the ribs with her elbow. You knew that already. His gate came second place, but he didn't mind. The mayor had already offered him a contract to redo the cemetery fencing. And 3 townsfolk had inquired about commissions. That night, under a string of lanterns and a canopy of stars, Marigold and Thomas danced to music from a fiddle and a drum. She leaned her head against his chest. Did you ever think it would be this good? No, he whispered. But I hoped. Late summer brought a different rhythm. School paused, gardens overgrew, the forge glowed steadily. Marigold spent more time in the fields, helping with harvests, laughing. With Edith, teaching Mrs. Calder's new cat not to swipe at chickens. One morning, as she scrubbed carrots in a bucket, she felt a wave of dizziness. She sat on the porch and drank water, brushing it off as heat, but it returned, twice, then 3 times. By the end of the week, even Edith noticed. You all right? Fine. Just summer fatigue. Edith narrowed her eyes. Marigold. When was your last? Monthlies? She blinked and blinked again. She stood without answering, walked inside, and sat in the pantry. Her hands trembled. Could it be? She told Thomas that night, curled beside him in bed, her voice no louder than a breath. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he pulled her so tightly against him she could barely breathe. The pregnancy became their quiet secret at first. A bubble of wonder shared in glances and soft smiles. The town learned soon enough, it always did. But by then, Marigold had already transformed. She moved differently, slower, surer. Her body ached in new places, but her heart swelled to hold. The anticipation. Thomas was attentive to the point of worry. He built a rocking chair, reinforced the bed frame, started carving a cradle out of sycamore. The same tree we married under, he said. Ernest carved a mobile. Mrs. Calder knitted blankets. Edith brought tea and questions. Marigold kept teaching, though she now sat more often. Her students, bless their tender hearts, tried to help in every way. I read ahead, Miss Calder. Want me to help with the lesson? Don't worry, I'll fetch the chalk. One child drew a picture of her with a big belly and a smile. She pinned it on the wall. In the final weeks of the year, as the days shortened and frost returned, Marigold stood on the porch and watched the land. She thought about everything that had brought her here: letters, choices, fear, courage. A mail-order bride, they once called her. A woman desperate for a new life. Now she was a wife, a teacher, a mother --be. She was Marigold Calder, and everything she had grown into had taken root not in ease, but in resilience. Thomas stepped onto the porch, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. "The baby's kicking again," she said. He knelt, placed a hand on her stomach, and smiled. "You ready for this?" "I was born for it," she whispered. And under a sky full of stars, with the sycamore standing tall in the distance, they waited together for the next chapter of their story to begin. Winter did not so much arrive as descend, fierce and immediate. One morning, they awoke to a world buried under snow, every surface glittering with frost. The wind howled across the plains like a morning song, seeping into every crack of the house despite Thomas's careful reinforcement. Marigold stood by the window, a wool blanket wrapped tightly around her, as she watched Thomas shovel a path to the barn. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach. The child had grown stronger with each passing week. Every kick, each roll and turn, grounded her more deeply in the reality of what was coming. She was no longer a woman waiting for change. She was change. A life growing inside her, dependent on every breath she took, and still she taught. Church classrooms stayed open until the roads were too dangerous to navigate. Parents sent children in boots too big and coats too thin, and Marigold did what she could to keep their minds warm, even when their fingers were blue. She taught poetry while their feet hovered over warm bricks wrapped in flannel, and spelling with mittens on, but it was getting harder. Her body moved slower. Her back ached more each day. And one afternoon, while writing out arithmetic on the chalkboard, her vision blurred. She steadied herself with one hand, the other flying to her stomach. A girl screamed. Miss Calder. She was all right. But it was enough to make her stop. "It's time to rest," Thomas said that night, stroking her hair as she lay on the couch. "I can keep going." "No, you can't. Not like before." She sighed, her pride wounded more than her body. But he was right. And so, she stepped back from teaching, turned over lessons to a volunteer parent, and spent her days preparing for the baby. The house transformed. The cradle Thomas carved gleamed from daily polishing. The room beside theirs became a nursery. Books lined the walls. Ernest painted stars on the ceiling. Mrs. Calder taught her old lullabies, and still the snow fell. The due date loomed closer. By February, the roads were impassable. The doctor, a kind man named Holt, visited weekly despite the conditions. He checked her pulse, the baby's position, the way her ankles swelled, and gave soft encouragement. "Strong heartbeat," he'd say, just like his mother. They didn't know if it was a boy or girl. They didn't want to. "We'll love whoever arrives," Thomas said one night. "What if I'm not ready?" "You're more than ready." But still, fear crept in at the edges. She'd never done this before. She'd never brought a child into the world, never been responsible for someone so wholly. She feared pain. She feared the unknown, but she feared not trying more. The night it began, the storm had just let up. The house was quiet. Ernest had gone to town to deliver a new plow, promising to return by supper. Mrs. Calder was napping. Thomas was at the forge. Marigold was peeling apples in the kitchen when the first pain hit. It wasn't sharp, just deep, like something shifting inside her. She waited, counted. The next wave came 20 minutes later. Then 15. She didn't panic. She prepared. By the time Thomas returned, her knuckles were white on the chair rail. "It's time," she said. His face went pale, then all action. He fetched hot water, called for Edith, stoked every fire. Dr. Holt arrived just as her contractions became unbearable. "Breathe, Marigold," he said. "You're doing well." She wanted to scream, Instead, she gripped Thomas's hand until she thought his bones would break. Labor lasted 12 hours. The wind picked up outside. The shutters banged. The fire crackled. Inside, time stretched and bent and blurred. She cried. She moaned. She whispered prayers to saints she didn't believe in. And then a cry. A single, beautiful, piercing cry that cut through every pain, every fear. Dr. Holt wrapped the baby and handed them to Marigold. "A girl," he said. "You have a daughter." She looked down into the wrinkled face, the blinking eyes, the tiny fists. "Hello," she whispered. Thomas knelt beside her, tears running down his cheeks. "She's perfect. She's ours." They named her Clara. It was a name from one of Marigold's favorite poems, and it fit like a blessing. The town came bearing gifts. Blankets, bottles, little hand-stitched shoes. Clara became everyone's child. The postmaster even declared her an honorary citizen of New Junction. Mrs. Calder wept when she first held her. Ernest, back from town, carved her a rattle. Edith declared herself godmother before anyone could ask. Marigold healed slowly. The days blurred into feedings and lullabies, into rocking chairs and little yawns. Thomas built a snow fort just outside. The window, so Clara could look out and always see something made just for her. By spring, the world softened again. Marigold returned to teaching part-time. Edith watched Clara during school hours. The house buzzed with purpose. And one morning, while planting seeds in the garden, Marigold felt the wind shift. Not just in the weather, but in her spirit. She was a mother now, a teacher, a wife, but she was still Marigold. Still the girl who boarded a train with a paper promise. Still the woman who dared to believe a better life waited beyond the unknown. That belief had carried her through storms, through sorrow, through labor pains and quiet joys. And now, as Clara gurgled beside her in a basket of quilts, she knew her story was just beginning. The first year of Clara's life unfolded like a song, not without its missed notes, but beautifully strung together with laughter, worry, and awe. Each day brought something new, a sound, a movement, a smile that turned into giggles. Marigold kept a journal just for Clara, chronicling each little milestone. Clara rolled over today, she wrote one warm May afternoon. She kicked at the blankets like she was furious with gravity. Thomas read the entries at night, one leg slung over the edge of the bed, boots still dusty. He'd smile, shake his head and say, "She's got your fire." To which Marigold would reply, "She's got your stubbornness." Ernest taught Clara how to stack wooden blocks. Mrs. Calder read to her in soft, aged tones. Edith came by every other day just to hold her and declare, "She's the best reason this town's ever had to behave." School resumed that fall, and with Edith's help and Mrs. Calder's supervision, Marigold stepped back into the classroom full-time. Clara spent mornings at the house with her family and afternoons in the classroom when she could be quiet. The children adored her. "Can she talk yet? Does she sleep through the night? Can I hold her?" Marigold always smiled. Yes, sometimes, and gently. She watched the way Clara's presence changed the room. Lessons felt lighter. Even arithmetic seemed easier when followed by a baby's squeal of delight. And beneath it all, Marigold felt her life rooting deeper. In late October, tragedy struck the Dawson farm. A fire, sudden and brutal, tore through their barn. No one was hurt, but they lost animals, tools, feed, everything they needed to survive the winter. Thomas didn't hesitate. "We'll help rebuild," Marigold nodded. "We'll rally the town." Within days, New Junction gathered. Lumber was donated, soup pots bubbled over fires, and children brought what coins they had. It wasn't charity. It was family. Marigold stood with Clara on her hip, helping organize materials, delegating work groups. She was no longer the outsider. No longer the woman who arrived by train with a contract in her bag and questions in her eyes. She was one of Them. And when the barn stood tall again, new and proud, the Dawsons cried that winter was easier, not because the storms were gentler, but because they were stronger. Thomas's forge never slowed. His reputation had grown. People traveled miles for his craftsmanship. He made ornate railings, weather vanes shaped like eagles, even a delicate metal cradle for the church orphanage. Marigold's class grew too. Parents now trusted her with their children as they would their own kin. She taught more than facts. She taught self-worth, curiosity, kindness. And Clara learned. She took her first steps holding Ernest's fingers. She said her first word, Mama, while clapping in church. Life was no longer uncertain, that it was full. In early spring, a stranger came to town. He arrived on horseback, cloaked and quiet, his boots worn from travel. He stopped at the general store, asked after a woman named Marigold. The postmaster, Mr. Green, furrowed his brow. Why you asking? I knew her. A long time ago. News spread faster than lightning. Marigold found out from Edith. You sure it wasn't Aaron? She asked, heart thudding. No, Edith said. He had an accent, not from around here. Said his name was Bennett. Bennett. She remembered. A man from her childhood, someone she'd met at a library event. He'd once written her poems. He came to the school that afternoon. Marigold Baines, she stiffened. Calder now, he smiled. I thought it might be you. She led him outside. Why are you here? I heard you came west. I was passing through, and curiosity got the better of me. He looked older, softer, no danger. In his presence, just an echo of something she'd long outgrown. You found what you were looking for? He asked. She looked across the street where Thomas waited with Clara, waving. Yes, she said, and more. He tipped his hat. Then I'll be on my way. And he was. The orchard bloomed late that year, but when it did, it bloomed heavy. Branches bowed under pink blossoms. Bees buzzed like a hymn. Marigold took Clara walking through the rows every morning. They named the trees together. This one's Eliza, that's George, and the tall one is Franklin. She told stories of far-off places, of books she read in youth, of the train ride that changed her life. You came to me on a promise, she whispered, into Clara's curls, and I answered it, not with fear, but with hope. One afternoon, Clara pointed to the sky. Bird, she said. Marigold looked up. That's right, a robin. Thomas joined them, placing a kiss on both their foreheads. Do you ever think about the future? He asked. I used to dream it up. Now I just live it. He smiled. That's all I ever wanted. They stood in the orchard, sun warming their shoulders, their child cradled between them. And for that moment, everything was enough. The summer that followed Clara's first birthday was like a quilt stitched with sunshine and laughter. New Junction thrived, gardens overflowed, and the scent of honeysuckle curled through the streets like a blessing. Marigold often walked with Clara tucked against her hip, her eyes squinting in the morning light, cheeks round with delight. Thomas had built her a swing beneath the sycamore tree. Each morning before work, he would carry Clara out, strap her in carefully, and give her 3 gentle pushes. Marigold would watch from the porch, arms crossed over her apron, a smile dancing on her lips. The sound of Clara's giggles became as familiar as the rooster's crow. Teaching resumed at full pace by late September. Marigold felt ready, more confident than she'd ever been. The classroom had become an extension of her voice, a place where young minds blossomed as brightly as the fields beyond the windows. She added new lessons, geography maps pinned to the walls, letters to pen pals in neighboring towns. She brought Clara in each Friday, where the children learned to read softly, to share crayons, to laugh without scaring the baby. One boy, Samuel, once asked, "Is she going to be a teacher too?" "Maybe," Marigold said, smiling. "But first, she has to learn how to walk without falling." That walk came sooner than expected. On a crisp morning in mid-October, Clara let go of the kitchen table and toddled 3 uneven steps toward Thomas. Drop the log he was carrying. Did she just? She did. He scooped her up with such joy that Marigold felt it bloom in her chest. Later that evening, they marked the spot on the floor with a ribbon of chalk. Ernest drew a star over it. "First steps of the town's future mayor," he declared. Life, as always, was not without shadow. In November, Mrs. Calder's cough returned. It wasn't harsh at first, just a rattle at night. A clearing of the throat at breakfast. But by the third week, it stole her breath even when she wasn't moving. Dr. Holt visited, face grave. "She's tired, Marigold. Her body is fighting, but you should prepare." The house shifted to accommodate her decline. Thomas moved her bed closer to the hearth. Ernest sat beside her most evenings, reading the newspaper aloud. Marigold brewed tea, changed linens, and held her hand when she trembled. "Don't look at me like that," Mrs. Calder croaked one evening. "I've lived longer than most dared." "I just thought we had more time," Marigold whispered. "We always think that." One night, as snow began to drift again, Mrs. Calder asked to hold Clara. "Tell her who I was," she said, voice thin. "I will. Tell her I loved her before she ever opened her eyes." And 3 nights later, she passed quietly, her breath slipping into the dark like the final note of a lullaby. The funeral was small, but full of warmth. Marigold dressed Clara in soft white. Thomas stood at the sycamore with his arm around her. Ernest gave the eulogy, voice cracking only once. Marigold spoke last. "She took me in when she didn't have to. Loved me when I didn't. Yet believe I could be loved. She left me stronger than she found me. I'll spend my life trying to do the same for others." And then she laid a single sprig of rosemary on the grave. In the quiet weeks that followed, Marigold felt the weight of her grief settle not just in her bones, but in her routines. There was an emptiness to the house, a silence at dusk where once there had been humming. Clara filled some of that space. One afternoon, she toddled over, tugged at Marigold's apron, and held up a faded handkerchief. "Mama sad?" Marigold knelt. "A little." Clara wrapped her arms around her neck. "Mama K." And in that moment, spring returned with soft yellow light and the smell of wet earth. The orchard burst into blossom again, and with it came a renewal Marigold hadn't expected. She began writing in the evenings, stories for Clara, letters to distant cousins, even a few poems. Words flowed like a stream unclogged, and Thomas, reading them over her shoulder, kissed her temple. "You should publish these, maybe someday." But she wasn't writing for fame. She was writing to remember, to preserve the life they had built from dust and daring. On Clara's 2nd birthday, the town threw a picnic. They gathered in the town square with pies and lemonade. There was a fiddler's sack races, and a 3-tiered cake Edith had baked. Thomas lifted Clara high, and the crowd cheered. "To Clara Calder!" They shouted. Marigold stood beside him, her hand over her heart. She had come here on a gamble, alone. Afraid. Now she was rooted. Chosen. Loved. As the sun dipped low and the stars winked into view, she whispered to the sky, "Thank you. For every step. For every fall. For this." Spring passed like a sigh, and summer rolled in with the sound of bees in the fields and the soft padding of Clara's feet across the wooden porch. She had taken to walking with conviction now, arms outstretched for balance, her steps bold and uncertain at once. Her laugh had become a fixture of the Calder homestead, a clear, bell-like sound that drifted through open windows and brought every conversation to a pause. Marigold often found herself simply watching her daughter. How she examined the world as though it had been made for her. How she touched petals, rocks, and bark with the same reverence. How she cried when she didn't understand something and smiled the moment someone explained it. It reminded her of teaching, of herself. Thomas made Clara a small chair for the schoolhouse. Ernest painted it blue. Every child who sat near it treated it like a throne. One day in early June, A letter arrived postmarked from Chicago. Marigold opened it carefully, setting Clara on her lap as she unfolded the thick stationery. The handwriting was elegant, the language polite. Dear Mrs. Calder, it has come to our attention that your educational methods in New Junction have garnered praise and interest beyond the township. We would be honored to publish a feature about your rural teaching practices in our quarterly journal, Frontier Education. If you would consider contributing an article, please reply by month's end. Sincerely, Editor-in-Chief, Charles N. Thorne, Marigold. Blinked at the letter. A strange heat bloomed in her chest. Mama right? Clara asked, tugging at the corner. Maybe, she whispered. That night, she showed Thomas. He read it twice. You going to do it? She hesitated. I want to. But I haven't written professionally in years. You teach children to try. Now show them how. And so she did. Her article took weeks to craft. After teaching, after feeding Clara, after tucking her in beside the glow of a kerosene lamp, she would sit with a mug of tea and write. She wrote about one-room schoolhouses, about chalkboards worn thin, and children who came to class barefoot but curious, about how education wasn't just about reading and numbers, but about belonging, about being seen. When she sealed the envelope and handed it to the postmaster, her hands trembled, but her heart soared. July brought heat and tomatoes that split on the vine from fullness. The days stretched long and golden. Clara ran now, her little legs carrying her across the fields in chase of butterflies and chickens. One Sunday, as they sat at a church potluck beneath the shade of a massive oak, Edith leaned across the table. You know what I think? Marigold grinned. I usually do. You and Thomas should build another room. Marigold blinked. Another room? You know, Edith said, spooning cobbler onto a plate. For the next little one. Marigold choked on her tea. Thomas, sitting nearby, raised an eyebrow. Something you haven't told me? Marigold flushed. No, I mean not yet. He smiled. Well, when you do, we'll be ready. The journal arrived in August. Her article had been published. There it was, in black and white, her name, her words, her truth. Letters came soon after. From teachers in Nebraska, from mothers in Utah, from a pastor. In Arizona, they thanked her. They asked questions. They shared their own stories. Marigold realized she had done something beyond herself. She'd started a conversation. Thomas framed the article and hung it in the schoolhouse. Clara pointed at it each morning. Mama, but even joy casts a shadow. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the chickens cooed in their pen, Ernest collapsed. They found him by the barn steps, unconscious, blood on his lip. Thomas carried him inside. Marigold summoned Dr. Holt. A stroke, they said. Minor, but real. He would live. But his strength would never return fully. Ernest had always been the quiet backbone of the family, the steady hand, the second set of shoulders. Now he needed help. For every small task, Marigold moved his bed to the sunniest room. Clara brought him flowers each morning. Thomas wept once, late at night, when he thought no one would hear. Through hardship, they adapted. That was the rhythm of life, after all. Adapt. Adjust. Keep going. By September, Ernest could sit in the orchard again. He watched Clara run circles around the trees and chuckled softly. You know what I think? He told Marigold one afternoon. What's that? She's going to be a writer like her mama. Marigold smiled. Or a smith like her papa. No matter what. She is, he said. She'd be proud of where she came from. And Marigold, watching the sun filter through Clara's curls, believed it. By the time autumn fell again upon New Junction, a quiet certainty had settled into Marigold's life. Clara now ran freely through the orchard, hair wild, hands always full of leaves or half-eaten apples. The rhythm of their family life had found its beat meals shared beneath the sycamore tree, Clara's giggles echoing at twilight, and Thomas's hammer ringing steadily from the forge. Marigold had submitted a second article to Frontier Education. This one more personal. It spoke of parenting in tandem with teaching, of the unique harmony forged when family and purpose intertwined. She titled it, Lessons in Clay and Cradle. By October, the editor responded with enthusiasm, requesting more. They even offered a modest stipend. It wasn't much, but it was the first time Marigold had been paid for her words since she was a teenager. She stared at the check with trembling fingers. "You earned it," Thomas said, wrapping his arms around her. "Every word." Clara patted the paper and declared it Mama's shiny paper. With Ernest's condition stabilized, he had taken to carving again smaller pieces, delicate work. He made a set of alphabet blocks for Clara and a wooden doll with bendable limbs. "Not just toys," he told Marigold. "She's learning how to shape the world, one object at a time." Marigold nodded. "She's got your hands and your eyes." Edith had started courting someone, a widower from the neighboring town, a schoolmaster named George Rollins. He was quiet but kind, the sort of man who brought flowers even when there wasn't a reason. Clara took to him immediately. One Sunday, over coffee and cinnamon rolls, Edith blurted it out. "We're getting married." Marigold let out a soft gasp. "Edith, that's wonderful. You'll stand beside me, won't you?" "Of course, and Clara can throw flowers. If she doesn't try to eat them." The wedding was held in late November, just before the snow returned. A soft amber sun bathed the fields as Edith walked down the aisle in a deep burgundy dress. George waited for her beneath the town's bandstand, now draped in lace and ivy. Marigold stood with her, holding her bouquet, and Clara, in a tiny white dress, threw petals like she was scattering crumbs for birds. Thomas played violin alongside. The pastor. Ernest cried quietly. Mrs. Rollins, now officially, kissed Clara on both cheeks after the vows. "You're the best flower girl in the county." Clara beamed. "I did good." Winter came soft that year. Snow dusted the fields like powdered sugar. The town square glowed with lanterns. Thomas built a sleigh with sleigh bells, and they rode it every Sunday after church, bundled in scarves and laughter. Marigold spent evenings writing more stories for the journal, essays for future readers, and always the journal for Clara. "You said Mama brave today when I killed a spider. Thank you, even though I wasn't." She found herself dreaming of books of publishing collections, maybe even teaching writing someday. The future felt wide and open, like the prairie before dawn. Then one day, Clara fell ill. It began with a cough. Then came the fever. Dr. Holt arrived by nightfall. "Nothing serious yet," he said, though his eyes were clouded. "But keep her warm, hydrated, watch her breath." For 3 nights, Marigold didn't sleep. She rocked Clara beside the fire, counted her heartbeats, whispered old lullabies. Thomas sat with them, eyes bloodshot. "Come on, little one," he murmured. "Don't scare us like this." On the 4th night, the fever broke. Clara opened her eyes, reached out, and whispered, "Apple." Marigold sobbed. The sickness passed, but the lesson lingered. Life, she realized, was not built on certainty. It was built on the choice to love deeply, even when nothing was promised. She held Clara tighter each night, kissed Thomas more often, let Ernest read her his woodcutting sketches, even when they made no sense, wrote longer letters to Edith, now living in town with George, taught her students like every lesson might be their last. That spring, Clara turned 3. She blew out 3 candles, declared herself a big girl, and asked to go to school, like Mama. Marigold enrolled her in a small morning group, half play, half lesson. On the first day, Clara kissed her cheek and waved goodbye without a tear. Marigold watched her walk in, backpack bouncing, head high. Thomas joined her on the steps. She didn't even look back. Marigold laughed through the ache in her chest. "She's ours, through and through." He took her hand. "We did good, didn't we?" "We're still doing good." And as the spring sun rose high, painting the fields in gold, Marigold closed her eyes. She had arrived in this town with a letter and a dream. Now, she had a life stitched together by love, sorrow, strength, and growth. And somewhere deep in her chest, she knew this story wasn't close to ending, that it was only beginning again. The next season in New Junction brought change, not the kind that sweeps like a storm, but the kind that creeps in gently, quietly rearranging the furniture of one's life. Clara was growing fast. Her speech had expanded in leaps, full sentences. Now thoughtful questions and declarations of love and frustration alike. Mama, why is the sky blue? Because sunlight dances with the air, and blue wins the race. Clara considered this. Then I want to dance with the sky too. Marigold spent many afternoons teaching Clara letters at the kitchen table. The little girl would trace M for Mama and T for Thomas, her tongue poking from the corner of her mouth in deep concentration. When she finally mastered writing her name in wobbly crayon, she ran around the yard holding the paper like a flag. Thomas began giving her small tasks in the workshop, holding nails, handing over hammers. It was all symbolic more than functional, but Clara took it seriously, wearing an apron that hung nearly to her ankles. She's going to run this place someday, Thomas said, watching her. And build it better, Marigold replied. Marigold continued to write. Her articles began to draw more attention. A well-known regional magazine reached out for a full-length feature. The editor, a sharp and thoughtful woman named Eleanor, wrote to her personally. Your voice, Mrs. Calder, speaks to a generation of women who are making their own maps. Marigold. Reread that line for days. Thomas framed the letter. It was around this time that Ernest's health began to decline again. There was no single event, just a slowing. A slurring of speech. He grew tired sooner, needed help with basic tasks. Marigold and Thomas took turns caring for him, and Clara sat by his side each evening with her books. Tell me a story, Grandpa Ernie. He would smile, pat her head, and begin. Stories of bears in the forest, rivers that whispered secrets, and birds who turned into stars. Marigold recorded many of them in her notebook. So they won't be lost, she told Ernest. He nodded, too tired to speak. One evening in late October, he passed in his sleep. Peaceful. Still. No struggle. Thomas didn't say much for 3 days. Clara asked, where did Grandpa go? Marigold knelt. To a place where stars tell stories back. Clara nodded solemnly. Then I'll look up every night. The town gathered again, like they always did, for farewells and comfort. Ernest Calder had been more than just a man with calloused hands. He was history, roots, and memory. Marigold spoke simply. He built more than chairs and fences. He built peace. And the townsfolk wept with her. Winter came early. With Ernest gone, the house felt quieter, but not emptier. His tools remained. His chair at the table. His presence, like a lingering song. Clara began asking deeper questions. Will I grow up and be like you and Papa? You'll be like you, my darling, and that will be more than enough. She thought on this for a while, then said, I want to help people too. Marigold hugged her. You already do. Thomas began crafting new commissions for people in distant towns. Word had spread about his ironwork, delicate yet strong, elegant yet dependable. He made lantern hooks, decorative gates, even a memorial bench for a war widow 3 towns over. Every item held his fingerprint. And Marigold saw that he, too, was growing beyond New Junction in subtle, steady ways. Think we'll ever move? She asked one night. He blinked. Why would we? Not soon, but maybe, someday. If Clara dreams bigger then. This town. Thomas looked toward their daughter's bedroom, a slow smile rising. Then we'll build her wings. The next spring, Marigold was invited to speak at a conference. In Chicago. She had never been back. The idea of standing in front of strangers, of being more than a quiet presence behind the pen, terrified her. But Thomas said, you tell everyone. else to be brave. Time to walk your own advice. Clara added, I'll make you a lucky bracelet. The trip was a blur of steam engines, bustling streets, towering buildings. Marigold stepped onto the stage in a modest blue dress and took a deep breath. I came here years ago as a stranger to this place. I boarded a train west not knowing who I was going to be. But I found myself in a tiny town, in the dust and the rain, in the cradle of a daughter and the arms of a man who gave me space to grow. The room held its breath. She continued. Education is not just knowledge, it's sanctuary. It's permission to try, to dream, to become. When she finished, the applause rang long and loud. A woman approached her after. I wish my teacher had been like you, Marigold smiled. I think she was. You just didn't know it then. She returned to New Junction 3 days later, tired but renewed. Thomas met her at the station with Clara on his shoulders. Mama, Mama. I missed you all the way to the moon. Marigold laughed, eyes bright. Well, I brought the stars back with me. And she had. She carried within her the light of something new, not fame, not pride, but purpose. Spring melted into summer with the ease of a song slipping into its chorus. The fields swelled with color-green shoots, wildflowers, endless waves of gold. Marigold had taken to walking barefoot in the tall grass with Clara, their hands brushing through wheat and air alike. Clara asked more questions now. Questions about the stars, about why bees buzzed, about where the wind went when it disappeared. And Marigold, always careful to answer with both fact and wonder, found herself rediscovering the world through her daughter's eyes. The sky is so big, Clara whispered one evening. Big enough to hold every dream we haven't spoken yet. Marigold replied. At the schoolhouse, Marigold noticed a change. Her students, some of whom she'd taught since their first letters, were beginning to outpace the material. A few had developed special talents, Sarah with her poetry, Timothy with engineering questions well beyond his years. It stirred something in Marigold. She wanted more for them. For all of them. One evening over dinner, she spoke with Thomas. What if we started a new school? He blinked. A new school? One that isn't just a one-room setup. A place for older students with deeper subjects. Science, literature. Maybe even languages. He set down his fork. You mean a real academy? Why not? The town is growing. The children are too. He smiled slowly. Then let's start laying the foundation. By fall, the dream had begun to take shape. Land was donated by a retired farmer. Edith returned to help plan the curriculum. George Rollins offered to teach history. Thomas and 2 other blacksmiths agreed to build the structure. Marigold reached out to the State Board for resources. They named it Hope Junction Academy. Clara liked to call it Mama's Big Classroom. Will I go there one day? She asked. If you want to, Marigold said. I want to teach butterflies. Then we'll build you a garden too. Construction began in winter. It was hard. Snow complicated every beam and nail. But the men worked with purpose, and Marigold supervised with hot tea and stronger will. The townsfolk volunteered labor and love. Teenagers painted signs. Mothers brought bread. Even old Mr. Green contributed benches. Marigold watched it all in awe. A school built by a town. For its children. Clara was 4 now, and already a force. She wrote her name in chalk on every surface she could find, including the chicken coop. She memorized poems and recited them to the mailman. She made friends easily and cried fiercely when parting. She's got your heart, Edith said. And his courage, Marigold replied, glancing at Thomas. Their family, once a dream scribbled on paper, now stood solid, real. On the first day of spring, the school opened. Marigold stood on the steps of Hope Junction Academy, Clara in her arms, Thomas beside her. A crowd gathered, students, parents, neighbors. She took a deep breath. When I first came here, I had nothing but a suitcase and a name. I didn't know this town. I didn't know myself. But this place gave me a reason to stay, to grow, to hope. She looked at the children. This building is more than wood and nails. It's a promise that your minds matter, that your futures are worth shaping. Applause rose like thunder, and Clara whispered, "Mama, I'm proud." That night, Marigold stood alone in the empty school. She ran her fingers along the desks. Listened to the wind tap on the glass. She remembered the train station, the letter, the fear dot and the choice dot to come dot, to stay dot to build dot. Her journey had not been easy, but it had been hers. And now it would belong to many. She lit the lanterns. One by one, let them glow dot. The academy waited dot, and the future had just begun. Hope Junction Academy flourished faster than anyone expected. Within a year, enrollment had doubled. Families from neighboring towns began sending their children by wagon, some staying in boarding rooms hosted by generous townsfolk. The academy quickly became more than a school. It was a symbol, a lighthouse on the prairie. Marigold found herself busier than ever. She taught literature and composition, mentored new teachers, and still made time to walk Clara home each afternoon. Their fingers intertwined like ivy vines. One day, Clara paused at the school gate. "Mama, will I be a teacher too?" "You can be anything you want, even a star watcher?" "Especially a star watcher." Thomas had expanded his forge. With 2 apprentices and contracts from towns all across the county, he worked longer hours, but always returned in time for dinner. He taught Clara how to shape small coils from wire, calling it the beginning of Blacksmith ballet. Their home, once so small and quiet, now pulsed with life. Neighbors dropped in with updates, students came seeking advice, and friends gathered often just to sit near the fire and talk. Marigold wrote in the evenings after Clara had fallen asleep. Her journals were full of stories, some for children, some for women, and some just for herself. She dreamed of publishing a collection one day. One summer afternoon, a telegram arrived from Chicago. It was from the publisher of a new anthology. "Your stories are raw, lyrical, and deeply human. We'd be honored to include 6 of them in our next volume." Marigold sat with the paper clutched in her hands, blinking away disbelief. Thomas kissed her forehead. "I hope you kept every draft." "I did," she said, laughing. "Even the terrible ones. Those are my favorite." That autumn, the anthology was published. Threads of the Prairie, it was called. Marigold's name was right there on the cover, beneath embossed gold letters. Clara carried it everywhere, showing it to anyone who would look. "My mama made this. It has stories about wind and grandpas, and things that are sad but kind." Marigold couldn't have described it better herself. Life had settled into something warm and rhythmic, like a waltz learned by heart. Until news came that shook it all. Thomas's younger brother, Caleb, had died in an accident. He'd been living far west, near the mountains. A mining incident, no wife, no children. Just one letter sent months before, mentioning a boy he'd taken in. A boy named Eli. They found the child at a neighbor's farm, frightened and silent. He was 6 years old. Marigold and Thomas didn't hesitate. They traveled by rail and wagon, a 3-day journey, to retrieve the boy. When they met him, he wouldn't speak, just stared at the ground and clutched a small wooden horse. Thomas knelt. "Hi, Eli. I'm your uncle. This is Marigold. We're going to take you home." He didn't respond, but he let them guide him into the wagon and all the way back to New Junction. He sat beside Clara, who chattered on about squirrels and sandwiches and school. By the time they arrived, Eli had smiled once, just once, but it was enough. Adjusting wasn't easy. Eli didn't cry, but he flinched at sudden sounds. He struggled with sleep. He didn't trust easily, but Marigold had learned patience. She read to him each night, let him choose which stories, sat with him even after the candles burned low. Clara, wise beyond her years, gave him space but not silence. She made room for him beside her, shared her crayons, called him my almost brother. Thomas built him a bed beside Clara's, a space that was his dot, and slowly Eli began to settle. He liked the garden, the stars, the chicken who pecked everyone but him, and one morning he called Marigold Mama. It was a quiet moment. She was braiding Clara's hair when he said it, like it had always been true. Marigold turned, heart-catching. "What did you say, sweetheart?" "Mama," he repeated, looking straight at her. She went to him, knelt, held him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, always." Thomas found them like that and joined the embrace. Their family had grown not with planning, but with grace, and it was stronger than ever. Hope Junction Academy added a new program that year, a grief support group. Marigold led it gently, using her own family's journey to help others. Her stories reached farther now, letters from distant states, invitations to speak, even a handwritten note from a senator's wife. But she never left New Junction for long. "This is where my roots are," she told a reporter. "Everything I write grows from here." And the town agreed. Marigold called her wasn't just their teacher or storyteller. She was their lighthouse. Hope Junction Academy celebrated its first anniversary with a town-wide gathering. Streamers fluttered from the eaves, and the air rang with fiddle music and laughter. Clara danced in circles with Eli, their joy as untamed as the prairie wind. Marigold stood at the center of it all, humbled. A year ago, it had been little more than a dream. Now it was a living, breathing legacy. As dusk fell, she took the stage, brushing wind-tousled curls from her face. This academy was built by hands that believed, hearts that endured, and minds that dared to imagine more. Let this be the first of many years of growth, courage, and community. The applause that followed wasn't just for her. It was for every nail driven, every child taught, every hope kindled. Clara and Eli had grown close. Though not siblings by blood, they were bonded by something even deeper: shared memory, shared home, shared healing. Eli now laughed freely, asked questions at supper, and had taken to sketching birds in a small notebook Marigold gave him. He told her he wanted to be a naturalist. "Or maybe an inventor," he added. "Or both," she replied. "Invent something that helps birds." Clara, meanwhile, declared herself an aspiring librarian princess, and insisted on organizing the classroom bookshelves by color, then by height, then back by color again. Marigold watched them with wonder. Two souls once small and uncertain, now blooming with possibility. In the second year of the academy, the state board sent an inspector, a woman named Mrs. Beatrice Fenwick. She arrived by train, corseted and skeptical, with spectacles perched low on her nose. Marigold greeted her. At the platform, "Welcome to New Junction." Mrs. Fenwick looked around. "It's smaller than I expected," Marigold smiled. "But larger than it used to be." The woman walked the school grounds, observed classrooms, took notes. At the end of the day, she asked to speak privately. Mrs. Calder, "You've accomplished something remarkable here. This model could work elsewhere, in many elsewheres." Marigold blinked. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you should consider consulting, training others. There's talk of a rural education initiative." Marigold hesitated. "I can send materials," Mrs. Fenwick said, gathering her gloves. "Think it over." That night, Marigold and Thomas sat on the porch, traveling. "Teaching others," she said quietly. "It's a lot, it is," he said. "But you wouldn't have to do it alone. And you'd be doing what you were born to do." She sighed. "And what about here? Hope Junction will keep running. You trained good people." She looked up at the stars. "I'll think about it." Weeks passed. Letters came. Offers grew. Marigold accepted one, a 6-week speaking tour to 3 towns within a day's ride, close enough to return each weekend. A trial. Her first lecture was in Silver Pine, a mining town turned farming hub. The school was barely holding together. Overworked teachers, Exhausted students. No supplies. She told her story. Answered every question. Stayed 2 days longer then. Planned. When she returned, Clara leapt into her arms. Did they like you? They needed me, and I needed them. With each trip, her confidence grew. Her name spread. Not with fanfare, but with respect, Thomas managed the home front. Clara and Eli, now 5 and 7, attended academy prep classes in the morning and helped tend the garden in the evening. Their drawings filled the house maps of imaginary kingdoms, blueprints for birdhouses, diagrams of rain. Marigold kept every piece. One day, Clara asked, "Mama, what happens when I grow up?" "What do you mean, love? Will I have to leave here?" Marigold brushed hair from her daughter's brow. "You won't have to do anything you don't want to. But if your dreams lead you far away, we'll cheer you on." Clara looked thoughtful. "And come visit, right?" "Always." In the 3rd year of the academy, tragedy struck the town, a barn fire during harvest season. No lives lost, but 3 families displaced, crops ruined. Livelihoods scorched. Marigold didn't hesitate. The school became a shelter. Classrooms turned to sleeping quarters. Students helped gather supplies. Teachers cooked. The community rallied. It was exhausting and beautiful. After 2 weeks, the families moved into rebuilt homes, and a child from one of those families stood during morning announcements. "Miss Calder, I want to be a teacher too, like you." Marigold blinked back tears. "You already are," she said. One snowy evening, a package arrived from Eleanor, the publisher who first printed Marigold's essays. Inside was a book, Lanterns of the Prairie, essays and lessons from Marigold Calder. Her own. Marigold sat in stunned silence as Clara traced the gold lettering. "You're in a real book, Mama." Thomas wrapped his arms around them both. "You always were." It just took the world time to catch up. The months that followed the book's release felt like a whirlwind of praise, invitations, and newfound identity. Marigold Calder's name, once whispered only among local teachers and neighbors, now appeared in journals, bookshops, and reading clubs across the state. Hope Junction, that small prairie town with a big dream, had become a symbol of what community and conviction could do. Still, Marigold kept her feet on the ground, literally, most mornings. She could still be found barefoot in the garden with Clara and Eli, planting seeds or chasing chickens. Fame never replaced routine. It simply added to the tapestry. The academy thrived. Enrollment pushed them to consider adding a second building. Older students began mentoring younger ones, and a student-led paper called The Junction Voice launched. Its first issue with the headline, "Our Town, Our Words, Our Future." Eli wrote a piece on local birds. Clara drew the illustrations. Marigold cried when she saw it. "Look, Mama," Clara beamed. "I'm published too." Marigold hugged her tightly. "Yes, you are. And I hope it's just the beginning." Marigold was asked to join the State Education Advisory Board. At first, she hesitated. "That's a big commitment," Thomas said one evening, sharpening tools at the forge. "Bigger than I ever imagined. But you imagined this place. You imagined this life. You can imagine what comes next," she smiled. "Then maybe I will." Traveling became more regular, though always with intention. Marigold limited her trips to weekends or week-long stretches. She always returned to New Junction with stories, sketches from Clara, and handmade gadgets from Eli. She missed dinners, yes. But she also taught hundreds of educators, shared blueprints for rural schools, and helped draft a bill that would eventually fund community-based education hubs across the state. Thomas called her his storm in a teacup. Fierce, beautiful, contained. On Clara's 7th birthday, they held a lantern festival at the academy. Children crafted paper lanterns, each one bearing a dream. Some said doctor, others said singer, scientist, dancer, and one simply read, good. Marigold asked Eli about his. Safe, he said quietly, for everyone. She kissed his forehead. That's the best kind of dream. That night, the sky was dotted with floating light. Thomas played violin, and the town stood still, basking in possibility. News came in summer. Mrs. Beatrice Fenwick had retired. The Education Board asked Marigold to consider filling her seat. It would mean regular travel to the capital, influence on policy, a powerful platform. But also time away. More than before, she brought the letter to the dinner table. Clara, Eli, what would you think if I had to leave more often? Clara frowned. How often? A few days every month. Maybe more, but I'd always come back. Eli shrugged. As long as Papa doesn't burn the soup. They all laughed. Thomas reached across the table. We'll be here waiting, Marigold nodded. Then I'll do it. For all the little towns who need a voice. Her first year on the board was exhausting, enlightening, frustrating, triumphant. She fought for libraries, teachers' wages, free lunches. Some victories were small: a new roof for a school in Pine Hollow. Others were large: the passing of the Rural School Grant Initiative. Marigold learned to navigate politics with the same grace she used in the classroom, listening first, speaking clearly, and always centering the children. She made allies, mentored younger educators, and never missed a birthday. Hope Junction remained her home base. The academy built a second building named the Calder Wing. Against her protests, students from 3 counties now attended. The curriculum included music, farming sciences, women's history, and creative writing. Marigold continued teaching a weekly class. Writing is memory made visible, she told her students. Even if you never share your words, let them live. She published a second book, Rooted Wings, a blend of essays and letters. It became a staple on school reading lists. One evening, Clara found Marigold asleep at her desk, surrounded by papers. Mama, are you okay? Marigold stirred. Just tired, love. So much to do. Clara pulled a blanket over her. Then maybe you should write about rest. Marigold smiled in the dim candlelight. Maybe I will. The months that followed the book's release felt like a whirlwind of praise, invitations, and newfound identity. Marigold Calder's name, once whispered only among local teachers and neighbors, now appeared in journals, bookshops, and reading clubs across the state. Hope Junction, that small prairie town with a big dream, had become a symbol of what community and conviction could do. Still, Marigold kept her feet on the ground, literally, most mornings. She could still be found barefoot in the garden with Clara and Eli, planting seeds or chasing chickens. Fame never replaced routine. It simply added to the tapestry. The academy thrived. Enrollment pushed them to consider adding a second building. Older students began mentoring younger ones, and a student-led paper called The Junction Voice launched. Its first issue with the headline, Our Town, Our Words, Our Future. Eli wrote a piece on local birds. Clara drew the illustrations. Marigold cried when she saw it. Look, Mama, Clara beamed. I'm published too. Marigold hugged her tightly. Yes, you are. And I hope it's just the beginning. Marigold was asked to join the State Education Advisory Board. At first, she hesitated. That's a big commitment, Thomas said one evening, sharpening tools at the forge. Bigger than I ever imagined. But you imagined this place. You imagined this life. You can imagine what comes next, she smiled. Then maybe I will. Traveling became more regular, though always with intention. Marigold limited her trips to weekends or week-long stretches. She always returned to New Junction with stories, sketches from Clara, and handmade gadgets from Eli. She missed dinners, yes. But she also taught hundreds of educators, shared blueprints for rural schools, and helped draft a bill that would eventually fund community-based education hubs across the state. Thomas called her his storm in a teacup. Fierce, beautiful, contained. On Clara's 7th birthday, they held a lantern festival at the academy. Children crafted paper lanterns, each one bearing a dream. Some said doctor, others said singer, scientist, dancer, and one simply read, Good. Marigold asked Eli about his. Safe, he said quietly. For everyone. She kissed his forehead. That's the best kind of dream. That night, the sky was dotted with floating light. Thomas played violin, and the town stood still, basking in possibility. News came in summer. Mrs. Beatrice Fenwick had retired. The Education Board asked Marigold to consider filling her seat. It would mean regular travel to the capital, influence on policy, a powerful platform. But also time away. More than before, she brought the letter to the dinner table. Clara, Eli, what would you think if I had to leave more often? Clara frowned. How often? A few days every month. Maybe more, but I'd always come back. Eli shrugged. As long as Papa doesn't burn the soup. They all laughed. Thomas reached across the table. We'll be here waiting. Marigold nodded. Then I'll do it. For all the little towns who need a voice. Her first year on the board was exhausting, enlightening, frustrating, triumphant. She fought for libraries, teachers' wages, free lunches. Some victories were small: a new roof for a school in Pine Hollow. Others were large: the passing of the Rural School Grant Initiative. Marigold learned to navigate politics with the same grace she used in the classroom, listening first, speaking clearly, and always centering the children. She made allies, mentored younger educators, and never missed a birthday. Hope Junction remained her home base. The academy built a second building, named the Calder Wing. Against her protests, students from 3 counties now attended. The curriculum included music, farming sciences, women's history, and creative writing. Marigold continued teaching a weekly class. Writing is memory made visible, she told her students. Even if you never share your words, let them live. She published a second book, Rooted Wings, a blend of essays and letters. It became a staple on school reading lists. One evening, Clara found Marigold asleep at her desk, surrounded by papers. Mama, are you okay? Marigold stirred. Just tired, love. So much to do. Clara pulled a blanket over her. Then maybe you should write about rest. Marigold smiled in the dim candlelight. Maybe I will. The snow melted slowly that year, retreating like a reluctant guest. Spring crept in with soft rain, tender buds, and the smell of wet earth. Marigold felt it in her bones, not just the season changing, but a new chapter rising. Her second book, Rooted Wings, had just been published. It was a collection of essays and letters written over the years, some hopeful, others aching. One was titled, To the Woman Who Left the Train Before Me. It resonated with readers. You gave voice to something I didn't even know I needed to hear, one woman wrote. I didn't leave the train, but I wish I had. Another said, Thank you for reminding me I can grow where I land. Marigold saved every letter. She replied to each one. Clara and Eli were thriving. Now in their formal classes, Clara had taken to storytelling, writing long-winded fables about sky turtles and feathered kings. Eli preferred facts. He read aloud at supper about volcanoes, moon phases, or inventions made by children. Did you know a 12-year-old invented the trampoline? He exclaimed one night. Thomas laughed. That explains why it feels like flying and falling all at once. Clara leaned over her soup. I want to invent something too. Maybe a machine that catches dreams. Marigold smiled. Then start sketching. With the success of Rooted Wings, Marigold was invited to speak in larger cities, St. Louis, Denver, even Boston. She declined the longest trips, preferring to remain close to home, but she agreed to a 3-week series in Missouri, with Thomas and the children joining her for part of it. They traveled by rail, bundled in scarves and excitement. Clara stared out the window as trees whipped past. It's like the land is running beside us. Or we're flying above it, Eli added. Marigold kissed their foreheads. Or maybe we're being carried. In Missouri, the reception was warm. Crowds lined up for books, readings, and Q&As. Marigold spoke about education, motherhood, and reinvention. She stood tall on every stage, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. She told the story of a letter, a train ride, and a little town that changed. Everything, every room she entered fell silent. Not because of fame, but because of truth. And when she returned home, the chicken still clucked, the soup still boiled, and Clara and Eli ran to her as though no time had passed. Summer came with a new project, a community garden led by Academy students. Clara designed the layout. Eli researched irrigation. Marigold wrote an article titled, "What Children Teach the Earth." Neighbors donated seeds, tools, and even a scarecrow named Millie. Every Saturday became a planting party. Tomatoes, beans, sunflowers. The harvest would feed the town, but the experience fed the soul. One evening, after a long day in the garden, Marigold sat with Thomas on the porch. "Do you remember the first night I arrived here?" He nodded. "You looked ready to bolt." "I almost did, but you didn't." She leaned into him. "Because of you." "No," he whispered. "Because of you. I just held the space. You grew in it." Autumn brought a surprise. Eleanor, her publisher, visited Hope Junction. She arrived with a leather satchel, boots caked in travel, and a gleam in her eye. "You need to write a novel," she said, skipping pleasantries. Marigold blinked. "A novel?" "Fiction. But grounded in truth, perhaps." "A mail-order bride who becomes more." Marigold laughed. "That sounds dangerously familiar." "Exactly," Eleanor said. "Write her story the way only you can." Marigold thought on it for weeks. And then one quiet morning before sunrise, she began to write. "I didn't come to New Junction to fall in love. I came to breathe again." Marigold wrote every morning before the sun peeked over the hills. The novel came in waves, sometimes soft, other times ferocious. It wasn't her story, not exactly, but it held the truth of her beginnings, the pulse of her fears, and the quiet triumphs that had defined her journey. She named a character Lark, a woman who, like her, arrived in a strange place with nothing but hope stitched into her hem. But Lark had a sharper tongue, a hidden past, and a letter she never sent. As Marigold wrote, Lark took on a life of her own. Thomas read chapters in the evenings, his eyes gleaming. "You've done more than tell a story," he said. "You've bottled a windstorm." Outside the pages, life continued its steady rhythm. Junction celebrated its 5th founding day with a parade and picnic. Clara led the children's poetry reading. Eli showed off a hand-cranked bird feeder that whirred like a windmill. "Mama," Clara whispered after her turn, "do you think words can fly?" Marigold looked at the crowd, at the banners made of verse and painted quotes. "They already are." That winter, snow came early and deep. The town bundled tighter. Fires burned longer. And at the academy, students wrote winter haikus on paper snowflakes hung from windows. Marigold's favorite read, "Frost bites the old fence. Inside, we bake bread and laugh. The world turns slower." She tacked it above her desk. Eli turned 10. In spring, he requested a stargazing party. "No cake, just constellations," he said. So they drove outside town, set up blankets, and pointed at the sky. Clara made up stories for each cluster. "That one's the crown of the wind, and that's the dog who ate the moon." Eli drew them later in chalk, then ink, then color. Marigold wrote a story about a boy who charted stars to find his way back home. The novel was nearly done when the letter came. Literary Festival in New York City had chosen Rooted Wings for a spotlight. They wanted Marigold to speak, sign books, and teach a workshop. "I don't know," she said, rereading the invitation. Thomas took her hand. "You once stepped off a train into the unknown. This is just another platform," she smiled. With more ink and less dust. New York was thunderous and bright. Marigold walked among stone giants, the city pulsing like a heart too large to hold. But the festival was intimate. Readers wept, teachers asked questions. Young women said, "You made me believe I could begin again." When she read from her novels. Opening chapter, the room fell silent. I didn't come to New Junction to fall in love. I came to breathe again. A pause. Then applause like rain. Back home, Eli and Clara tackled her with stories of garden frogs and an egg that had finally hatched. "You were gone forever," Clara declared. "It felt like forever," Eli agreed. Marigold kissed their foreheads. "Then I'll stay put a while." And she did, long enough to finish the final chapter. The novel was published in early autumn. Letters to Lark, it was called. It climbed reading lists and hearts alike. But Marigold remained grounded. She still taught her weekly class, still read bedtime stories, still grew tomatoes and took notes on Moonlight. Years passed. Clara became a writer in her own right. Her first short story was published at 15. A wild tale about a fox with a broken compass and a crow who remembered every lie ever told. Eli studied the stars, built his own telescope. He dreamed of working at an observatory. "But only if it has a garden," he added. "Somewhere quiet." Marigold. And Thomas watched them grow, not into replicas, but into wonders. Different, dazzling wonders. At 61, Marigold stepped down from the academy. A new headmistress took her place, a former student named Naomi. "Are you sure?" Naomi asked. "You're the heart of this place," Marigold smiled. "But hearts keep beating even when they rest." She focused on writing, on mentoring, on mornings with tea and memory. Her garden became a place of pilgrimage. Young writers came to walk the rows, sit on benches, and ask questions. Marigold answered them all. How do you know if you're a writer? If you're still asking, you probably are. What if no one listens? Then write anyway. Someone always will. How do you begin? With a truth too heavy to hold. One summer, as Marigold prepared a speech for the Academy's 20th anniversary, Clara brought her a package. Inside, an old, worn letter, the one Marigold had first sent. The one that brought her here. "I found it in the drawer of Papa's old desk," Clara said. It felt important. Marigold held it gently. The paper yellowed, the ink faded. But the hope? Still strong. She stood, walked to the garden, and read it aloud. Every word. To Mr. Thomas Calder, "I am not what you expect, but I am someone who tries. I am someone who listens. I am someone who hopes. If you can meet me with kindness, I will meet you with honesty. And maybe, between us, something steady can grow, with cautious faith." Marigold thorn. Something steady had grown indeed, and bloomed. And scattered seeds far beyond what either could have dreamed.